My headline view on this is not one that other people find particularly appealing, but it's not my job. It's not the job of us as academics to worry whether we're liked or not liked. It's whether our analysis is agreed with or not. And I would argue we've gone backwards. We've not gone forward. We have not progressed since Paris. And I think it's really dangerous to give the impression that we have. I'm not saying people haven't tried. And the reason I say that is because the problem is cumulative. That's the issue with climate change. The carbon dioxide and some of the other greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere year after year.
So welcome to the Fireside Carbon Chat, a no-nonsense climate podcast with Kevin Anderson. And this is the first ever episode.
It is indeed, yes.
Yeah, and I'm hosting this, but then we're passing on this host and ownership to you. I mean, a co-ownership with Semus in a sense. So I should introduce myself as well. I'm Daniel Mossberg. I'm a lead outreach and educational coordinator at Semus, which is the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. And with me today, and as always in the podcast, I have Kevin Anderson, Professor at Tyndall Center, Manchester University, also visiting researcher here at Uppsala University. And you get to introduce yourself a bit more a bit later on, because we have to go through all the practicalities of the pod and what we're trying to do here before you get this hero's journey question we ask. So, so a new podcast on climate hosted by Kevin Anderson. And this is some of the things I've written down that I hope we can do in this format, which is a bit different. It's also on YouTube, so it has that crowd as well. And we discussed a bit of this, but you can as well add at the end. So what we hope to do is give shorter comments and throw new logs on the fire of the climate debate and give honest and grounded critique. Highlight other people's work and voices through interviews by you, Kevin, or a guest host if we want to do that, and bring up good examples of work that is already going on. Then do in-depth interviews around your work, thoughts, feelings on the issues. And for the listeners, I'm hoping that they're learning something new and useful. It's not the same old things you hear about climate change. So I don't know if we can promise people to have them be surprised, but at least something new and learn something about all of this. Then, even more importantly, inspire to meaningful and effective work, action on all these issues on climate and all the issues connected to climate. So we can inspire, but also maybe give clear starting points in all of this. And lots more. Is there anything you feel like you want to add to this? I mean, it is a work in progress and we'll keep adding and changing things, but...
Well, it won't always be something radically new, but maybe often it might be a different take on an issue, a different sort of lens to look at the challenges that we're facing. But obviously, I mean, the basic science, it evolves, but it doesn't change radically. So that side of it doesn't change. I think sometimes the shock or the difference actually comes from literally from just looking from a different angle. And if that's something that we can do on the podcast, encourage others to look at it from different perspectives, but also then ourselves look at it from different perspectives, that would be important. It's always nice to someone comes in and says something that I thought, I've never thought of it like that before. And that's those moments you want. Then it makes you go away and reflect, and then sort of develop a more nuanced picture yourself.
Yeah, and I think that also is, bringing up other people's work and bringing up there's so many great books being written and there's so many people doing great work out there, but they're not highlighted in whether it's media or on like social media or the internet. So they're doing all of this great work, but it's in a very small space that... Yes, yeah.
But also I think sometimes you can bring in things that are not directly related to climate change. So there's lots of great literature, lots of great ways of thinking about all sorts of issues that go back, tens and hundreds of years. Sometimes that you can get insights from something that was written in the 1860s about a contemporary problem like climate change. And perhaps that's one of the issues, is that we've actually siloed climate change a little bit too much. I certainly think in terms of the ecological challenges that we're facing, which are huge. Climate is just one aspect of those. But it's easy, and I've fallen for this all the time. It's easy to just focus just on the climate element and also park the other issues as if somehow they are separate. But in the world out there, the real world out there, of course, there's no separation, there's no silos. The world doesn't operate along the convenient language that we use to separate the world into bits and pieces.
Okay, and then I thought we should just give a short background also on the podcast name, which we had a back and forth, and I did this long wrangling thing, and then we came to this at least tentative conclusion that it should be called the Fireside Carbon Chat, then based on the fireside chats that Roosevelt had in the late 20s and early 1930s. And it was basically a radio address when he spoke directly to the people out there, both people that voted for him, but also people in general, the whole of the US population. And it was radio new then, kind of an innovative medium, and also just being able to have a person far away sitting down talking directly into people's homes. And the podcast format is basically radio, so maybe I think it works.
Yeah, and I think there were other similarities. Firstly, he was writing at a time that was very difficult in the US and other parts of the world as well. But so there was a significant depression, a lot of unemployment, a lot of stresses in their society. And the other thing was, I think, was quite refreshing. I mean, they were of their time, so it's easy to critique them now, in hindsight. But he spoke with a degree of sort of honesty and vision that I think is often missing when we think about the challenges that we're facing today. So he didn't seem to shy away from things. He didn't seem to spin things in a way that it's just become completely normalized to spin issues. And in fact, I'd go slightly further. I think sometimes just to blatantly lie, then those lies become normalized. And then if you critique them, you seem to be extremist. But we've ended up living a lie on a lot of these issues. And I felt that he cut through that. I think it's also worth pointing out, because it's always easy to look at these things, that there's another older white man that was speaking to the nation. And in that case, now I'm an older white man here. But a lot of his, as I understand it anyway, a lot of his social concerns and drive for the people of the US came through his wife, through Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she was a really powerful figure and had a very strong social conscience. But of course, at those times, it was much more difficult for a woman to be heard. And so she had to, to some extent, she had to sort of speak through her husband. But I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't just him speaking. He was speaking with the voice of others as well.
Yeah, and maybe we should emphasize also for the listeners that you are not that old. You were not part of that era as well. So just remind you, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can kind of guess that Kevin was not part of the 1930s.
No, so, not quite.
Not quite. So, but that's a great bridge into like your own kind of introduction. So you grew up in the 60s and 70s, became an engineer, and now a climate scientist. So can you take us through some of the formative points in your life and give like a shorter introduction to yourself as well?
Yeah. I often get asked, was there some sort of great sort of turning point, some bright light? And no, I look back, I can't recall any particular moment. And so I was brought up next to a nuclear power station in the east coast, a very rural area on the east coast of England, East Anglia as it's called, where my dad worked as a mechanic, as what we call a fitter, but really a mechanic, at the power station. And we lived just down the road from the power station. My mom eventually became a teacher in a local primary school. But I lived in a rural environment next to the sea, both of which I absolutely loved. At a time, and also in East Anglia, and it's still like that there now really, it's a very quiet part of the UK. And you had complete freedom. So there was lots of what was called common land. As kids, we used to just call it the commons. Never really thought about what it meant. And now, of course, it's hugely important, this idea of the commons, the common land. And there was lots of that. We used to just be free. And it wasn't just my parents. I mean, all the parents that I knew, their kids would be out, sort of wild, wandering around the common land. And having that there and be next to the sea, and then also talking to my dad a lot about engineering, about science. Yeah, so and he's interested in nuclear power, but it was just in engineering and technology more generally. That gave me quite an interesting sort of mix, I feel when I look back on it, of a real interest in engineering and on science, but also a real love of being in a place that felt unsullied, if you like, by a lot of industrialization. I also used to go to Scotland a lot because my dad was from an island on the west coast of Scotland. Where my uncle was a shepherd over there. So, and I still go there regularly now. And that also coloured my view, seeing that beauty on the Isle of Arran. But on the way there, we used to call it my mum's original home. which is in Yorkshire near a town called Doncaster. And all of my mom's family came from a mining community, and the mines were still operating. And my brother and I, when we were kids, used to think this was fantastic, sat there looking at these mines operating. And it's only in retrospect when I look back and think, oh, those things were really important for me. So this combination of nature, rural environments, freedom, but then engineering and science, seeing the nuclear power stations, looking at the coal-fired power stations and seeing all of that. And I think, although it didn't play particularly strongly on my mind then in any clear way, when I look back, I think it was colouring how I would see the world for the rest of my life, and that's still really important to me now. So I left school at 16, which is quite unusual for academics, I suppose, and went off to work on ships. I liked being at sea. I liked being next to the sea. I liked being on the sea, and I liked working on engines. I liked working with my hands, and you never work with your hands. Actually, you work with your brain and your hands. And I think a lot of people, particularly a lot of academics, are quite critical when, they say, or they work with their hands. They talk about the technicians working with their hands. People who work with their hands also work with their brains. If they're working with their hands, they're almost always creative as well. And yet we're often quite pejorative towards those people in our societies, particularly in somewhere like the UK. And so I really enjoyed that time. Then later on I went to university, did an engineering degree, and then I went on to design and build offshore oil platforms. So I was in the design office, and then also working offshore on the rigs for quite a long time. And I enjoyed that as well. And at that time, climate change was becoming a big issue. I'd not come across it before, so I went back to university to do a master's and then a PhD, and then on eventually to become an academic. And so that was a sort of thread through my life. But I think a lot of it was, by the time I got to sort of 15, 16, a lot of my life had been coloured by that period of my life. And the rest of it sort of slotted in some ways to the views that I developed at that time. And I think I was very fortunate. There weren't that many middle-class families in the UK in those days. It was much more of a sort of working class. You were either working class or you were wealthy, one or the other. And so I was just surrounded by people like us who didn't have a lot of money. But you never thought about that. What you had was sort of love and security and a great community and fun and freedom and all of those things. And they've played in, again, to how I think about the world today. It helped me, particularly when I look back, realise that a lot of the material resources that we have now, and perhaps the aspirations we have for always more, that they're part of a problem. They're not what matters in the world. You need a basic sort of level, a sufficiency level. But really anything above that, I think probably is detrimental. It's very hard there's an allure of it. It's very hard to stop it. But I think if you step back from it, you can often think, God, that's not making life richer. That's making life more locked into particular things and creating a desire for things that you probably can't get and you don't need, and they're distracting you from doing the things that are really fun and worthwhile in life.
So let's dive into the issues. I've loosely built this on the lecture that we recorded with you in February 2025. So that's also on YouTube. You can watch that or on other social media. But I also, it's not summarizing and going back that much to the lecture. It's rather like finding some key points that we can talk about, and then we'll see how much time we have for all of this as well. But you brought up also this thing, and it's not specifically your research, but you know enough about physics and everything else about it, around the AMOC. And this is an English pronunciation exercise, Atlantic Meridional, is that? Meridional, yeah.
It's an awful sounding word, isn't it?
Overturning circulation I can pronounce as well. So the Gulf Stream is part of that, and all of that. And that's just one of the tipping points. So the question is, what thresholds in degrees of warming are we talking about? And then the whole thing around runaway climate change. So if you trigger one tipping point, does that trigger another tipping point or several tipping points? And then also connecting this back to the carbon budgets. But if you have a point where you activate these tipping points in the runaway climate change, then the carbon budget kind of thing is not really relevant anymore, right?
Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
That's certainly how I see it. So there are these tipping points that are out there, non-linearities, we sort of generally more common sort of language in the sort of scientific realm. And it's really tempting, I think, to put a number on them. So when do they occur? At what temperature? Is it 2.3 degrees or 1.7 degrees? And I think that to some extent misunderstands these issues. What we know is that they're out there somewhere. And we have some sort of handle on the range of temperatures that you may start to see these things playing out. And also some of them aren't instant, that you can see them building up. But so I think we have to be careful about adding too much precision. But from a policy perspective, from a real world perspective, all you really need to know is that they're not that far away, quite a few of these, and they are really, they're really serious. These absolutely dire repercussions over and above the sort of standard framing of climate change as we see it, which is pretty catastrophic anyway. But what we know is that as the temperature goes up, the risks of them occurring become greater, and it's not linear. So in the sense that every degree, every fraction of a degree that it goes up, the risk goes up by more than that. And to me, as someone looking at these issues, that's what the policymakers need to be taken on board. They don't need the precision. They just know that, God, if we don't do something about the emissions as they are today, we're increasing the risks of these absolutely dire repercussions. And once you have that, any reasoned policy framing surely has to take that into account, but clearly it's not taken into account. And so I have a feeling that most of the policy realm really it's just got its fingers crossed behind its back that not only that the standard way of looking at climate change, which is that as the emissions go up, you get higher temperatures, but that actually these tipping points as well, that we can just ignore those. And so there's almost like a sort of a denial. We accept the science, but we deny that it's going to have any real implications. And these tipping point issues, we are getting nearer and nearer to these. From what we can see, and some of the scientists that have been working on this, that between 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming and 2 degrees centigrade of warming, which when we sit here in Sweden, half a degree, so what? Actually, that is a huge difference in the amount of energy we're putting into the atmosphere and the impact we're having on the climate almost overnight. That those differences are sufficient that you may well find that we're hitting some tipping points between them. And also some of these tipping points, they will play out over the longer period. So you'll be locking in things like the complete melting of ice, almost the complete melting of ice on Greenland. That's 7 meters of sea level rise. That's not going to happen in a week, a year, even by the end of the century. But by the end of the century, we'll be seeing significant rises in sea level as a consequence of that. But they will go on, even if you stopped all emissions. So that's one of the concerns. Some of these points that you get to, even if you cease emissions, then things just keep going on. Now, it could be that actually some issues, they're sufficient that you actually get a natural feedback, which means that you're going to get lots more emissions as well. But even when you don't get more emissions, and the temperature doesn't necessarily go up anymore, you've already triggered changes that are catastrophic over the medium term, if you like, the 100-year, 200, 300-year period. And it's very easy to think, well, does that period matter? I mean, the end of the century seems a long way from now. But some people listen to this, their children will be alive at the end of the century. Their grandchildren certainly will be alive at the end of the century if we don't completely mess things up. So these are not very long time periods away. And yet we're taking these risks with these huge tipping point issues that play out globally. And they don't just play out in isolation, they play out in terms of what do they mean for agriculture? What do they mean for droughts and water? And that then plays out how the societies will operate, how there'll be internal migration within countries, which means that will start to create tensions. Then you'll get external migration. This will be played out on top of other issues that are going on, which often create some sort of military tension between regimes. So you can start to see that the climate initially is just exacerbating existing tensions. But then if some of these tipping point issues play out, it will be the cause of some of these tensions. And we're prepared to take that risk with our own children's future, with the beauty of this amazing planet that we're quite privileged very privileged to be on. We're prepared to take that risk. Our policymakers, the complicit silence, I think, of a lot of the science community who aren't prepared to speak out about these issues, the business people, the journalists, there's a sort of a cabal of delusion here. Perhaps it's just too difficult to accept. But ultimately, whether it's difficult for us or not, our children have to live through the repercussions of our preferring this delusion over honesty.
Yeah, and I think It was interesting also this TV interview that I saw on PBS Terra. They've done like in-depth kind of interviews, and it was a climate scientist or a team of scientists in Florida that was actually studying the Gulf Stream and trying to measure whether it was slowing down, and there was other things as well. And it was a lot of interesting things in their research, but also kind of if you zoom out, you could kind of see that there is enough research being done so you can understand these greater mechanics and talking about risks, but in the basic research, you need more research to understand more about these tipping points, basically. So, and also with the cutbacks in research funding in the US, or not even being able to mention the word climate, it also kind of cuts out. We won't know some of these things because some of the research now is just being shut down.
Yes, yeah. But we're not short of information, though, about knowing that we need to act with extreme urgency. And we're in an emergency situation. That language is often used by policymakers, then they go away and do nothing in terms of developing policy that aligns with emergency. But everything we know now tells us enough that we are in an emergency situation. So, yes, we do need more research. But so a lot of these things are a risks and the consequences issue. The consequences are dire, and the risks are getting greater as the temperature rises. So we are in the position where we're not waiting for more analytical work. We need to get on and put the action in place, and that's what we're failing on here so far.
And also we can come back to another, like one of these big climate science news around James Hansen's work, his recent work around, and the title of that was Global Warming Has Accelerated. So that's basically his basic argument. So maybe if you can like shortly summarize what his findings are, and also your kind of comments or critique of that.
So James Hansen has been at the sort of cutting edge of the science, for decades now. And his interpretations of the science are as valid as more, if you would like to say, more conservative interpretations. So often people try to contrast Jim Hansen and Michael Mann as two ends of the spectrum. But in some respects that's fair, because I think when you look at the science, there are sufficient uncertainties in it and sufficient numbers of assumptions that you have to make that with the same array of science, you can come to different conclusions. They're not, it's tempting to say they're radically different conclusions. They're not, and certainly not from a policy perspective. Both of them say from a policy perspective, we need urgent, rapid change. So I think I would say that Jim's work, it seems to me to be scientifically completely valid, as really does Michael Mann's, and the differences are sort of interpretations in that. And I think probably this is fed into sometimes by our own worldviews when we put the assumptions in there. So you might be arguing that Michael Mann's assumptions are slightly more conservative, slightly more hopeful, and Jim Hansen's ones are the more sort of, this is not looking good. So you take that more sort of, maybe not extreme, but the more impactful end of the science. And so you end up with that range. And it's very easy for others then to sort of say, oh, look, there's this huge difference. And I think that really misunderstands the process of science. And as we learn more, of course, some of these things will come together, and sometimes they'll go apart again as we might find more uncertainties. But overall, the framing is absolutely, whether you're on the Jim Hansen or the Michael Mann end of the spectrum, the policy repercussions are very similar. But having said that, I don't particularly warm to the policy diagnosis, if you like, or suggestions from either from Jim Hansen or from Michael Mann. And I think that there we have to be quite careful often, is that the scientists are not necessarily particularly good at understanding technology or society more generally. And I would probably argue that for both of these. And worryingly, I think on that side of it, although the science is it's all peer-reviewed and very good, on the other aspect of it, I think the time dimension is often missing in really understanding how rapidly you can make these changes, particularly in rolling out technologies. So I think we need other voices there need to step in. And I think there's often a muddling of science and engineering. So I come from an engineering background. That's what I understand. I find it really fascinating to read Michael Mann's science and all the other wonderful science that's out there. I find that fascinating, and I try and contribute a small part to that. But that's not my role. My role is to take that science and interpret that into what we need to do in terms of technology and therefore social change, and that's a time dimension element. which I think is missing from their sorts of analysis, both whether it's Jim Hansen or Michael Mann. A lot of scientists are, in my view, very gung-ho about technology. And I would even go as far as say a lot of academic engineers are. They may have built something in the laboratory, they may have actually got some CAD program on their computer that allows them to produce something, but producing it out there, where 8.2 billion people are living, where you've got towns and cities and infrastructures and all those other things that are out there, as well as the politics and culture and all those other things, I think they're often very naive about what you can actually do in the real world.
We should also talk about the Paris Agreement. I mean, it's been 10 years since 2015. And you base also your presentations and what we need to do, basically around carbon budgets, on the Paris Agreement and the language in the Paris Agreement and the kind of, is it targets? Is that the right word?
Well, I've never liked the language of target. I probably have used it occasionally, but I've tried not to use that language. I tried to use the word of commitment or obligation. I mean, that's what we made. It's not a target. They're not things to try to achieve. They're things to achieve.
And it's interesting, the UNFCCC, is that the correct one? Yeah, they put out like a YouTube short summarizing the 10 years after, which was very like hopeful and we're on the right track. And maybe they need to do that. And you have like 1 minute in a YouTube short. So anyways, but how your kind of take on this, how far have the world countries come on their work that they committed to in the Paris 2015 agreement, and also what kind of work lies ahead then for individual countries, but also the international community, institutions like the COP, but also especially now in a world where everything is kind of devolving into this strong autocratic men divide up the world kind of thing we're living in, because then, where does this take us? But start with like the 10 years of the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
Well, like where are we on this work? Where do we go?
My headline view on this is not one that other people will find particularly appealing, but it's not my job. It's not the job of us as academics to worry whether we're liked or not liked. It's whether our analysis is agreed with or not. And I would argue we've gone backwards. We've not gone forward. We have not progressed since Paris. And I think it's really dangerous to give the impression that we have. I'm not saying people haven't tried. And the reason I say that is because the problem is cumulative. That's the issue with climate change. The carbon dioxide and some of the other greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere year after year. And so if the problem is getting worse, so we're over 1/3 of a trillion tons of carbon dioxide being emitted since Paris. So what we face in 2025 is a much more challenging problem than we faced at the time of the Paris Agreement. Now, progress would require that what we were doing was at a greater rate than how much harder the problem was getting. Well, it's nothing like that. The problem's got a lot harder and emissions are still going up. So I'm not saying that you can, if you really look hard, you'll find little pockets of success. But if you stand back from it and look at the whole, we have fundamentally failed or are failing on the Paris Agreement. It is far more difficult today than it was then. So we have gone backwards. The best that I think we can describe our success is that our steps backward are not as large as they may otherwise have been. But that gives a very different sort of context to start to think about where we are and the challenges we face. And I would argue that's a much more truthful and blunt view of where we are in 2025 than this sort of hopium nonsense that is typically sold. We mustn't take away people's hope. Well, I mean, who's us? Who are we to then think we should have to be dishonest about, or at least to spin a narrative that's appealing to others? That's not our job as experts, as academics. We have to say it as we see it. And in my view, very clearly, we have gone backwards because the challenge we face today is so much more difficult than it was in 2015. And remember, it's even more difficult than it was if you go back to the UNFCCC you referred to earlier. That was back in 1992. It's 1/3 of a century ago. And yet emissions are still going up. So 1/3 of a century since our first major agreement, emissions are still rising. We've put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since our first agreement on climate change than we put in all human history up to that point. So I think any reasoned assessment of the problem that we face, understanding that the problem is cumulative, has to come up with the conclusion that we have failed and we are continuing to fail. I would even go slightly further and say that on the 1.5 degree C framing of of the Paris Agreement, that's gone. We will not be able to hold to warming of only 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I also have to reflect on that and say that here I am sat in Sweden, in the Northern Hemisphere, relatively wealthy white person, older man in the Northern Hemisphere, saying we've failed at 1.5. And to recognise, I have to think, stop and reflect, what does that mean? Well, that means that the lives and the livelihoods, or the livelihoods and the lives of some people, particularly poorer communities in the global south, those we have sacrificed their lives. Because it's not as if we didn't know about this, we did. And so the high emitters in our countries and the leaders in our countries, that we have actively and knowingly chosen not to make major cuts in our emissions, because we weren't prepared to make the sort of changes to our society that are necessary. And we are prepared to rip apart the lives and livelihoods of people in the global south, but also impose significant risks on our own children's prospects. I mean, it doesn't play out well for us when we think about, well, what does that mean about us as people? You know, we might have a facade that is one of caring, but is it really? How deep is that caring? I don't think, for us high emitters that have been part of this problem and knowing and understanding the issues, I would say that our care hasn't even stretched to our own children, let alone people elsewhere in the world. And it's a sort of, well, sometimes when I stop, it's a dark place for me, that almost more than the science. I feel like it's quite a dark place, because I think humanity can be much more than that. But there's something about the structures, the cultural structures that have dominated, particularly in the global north, that have underplayed our value as a citizen in this, and have overplayed our competitive consumer elements, if you like. And so I think we need to return to seeing ourselves as citizens, as parents, as brothers, as sisters, as members of our community, and also members of a global community, because we live in a globalized world. Our impacts are felt elsewhere. Other people's impacts are felt where we are. And to understand that, and through that lens of science can help understand this, then I think it might move us in a more positive direction. But when I look at Paris now, no, I think we are in an absolutely dire situation. There are lots of people on the climate realm who would agree with me that 1.5 has gone, that we can't stay there. And they would also have a heavy heart about it. In just a handful of years from now, the 2 degree C framing of climate change will be where 1.5 is today. If every country delivers on its promises, the promises they have made, following on from the Paris Agreement about cutting emissions or holding emissions static, if you add them all together, that's no change between now and 2030. By the very early 2030s, the challenge for 2 degrees centigrade will be where 1.5 is now. So literally, in a handful of years, we will have locked out 2 degrees centigrade as well, if the science is broadly correct on the size of the carbon budgets, let alone issues of tipping points. And I think that is really damning again, because in the UK, we had the government's Committee on Climate Change came out and gave it its report yesterday or the day before. And it's all talking about 2040 and 2050. I mean, even talk about 2030 in terms of we'll put the policies in place by then. That is literally too late. We're not talking about delivering from 2030. We're talking about delivering between now and 2030. And the only way that we've escaped that is by the expert community, many in the expert community, postulating future technologies to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we've been doing this for a long time in our models, because we are prepared to almost like question the physics rather than question ephemeral politics. We feel that our responses have to be politically acceptable. Well, the physics doesn't care whether it's politically acceptable. Yet we've locked into our models all sorts of Harry Potter-esque futures about hundreds of billions of tons being sucked out of carbon dioxide, being sucked out of the atmosphere. We're now using the language, we already use the language of negative emission technologies, which sounds like they exist, like fridges or washing machines. These things don't exist at scale. They're just ideas in a few professors or academics' heads and some incredibly small pilot schemes. That's all they are. But these and carbon dioxide removal, all of these things are built into the models. We're now building in the language of overshoot. We will go over the target and then our children will come back to it. That will lead on to the language of geoengineering. We'll change the words a bit, we'll come up with some new expression, but then we'll be embedding geoengineering into those solutions to make it so that everything still fits into a political acceptable lens. It doesn't. The politics of today is inadequate and insufficient to address the climate challenge. So our choice there is just to cross our fingers and hope for these mythical technologies to roll out in scale, or to actually be more honest with ourselves and drive major structural change, in the structural and social change in the near term.
Yeah, and all infrastructure, housing, or energy system changes you need to make, that takes time. I mean, it's a 5-10 year thing. Yeah. But what happens then to the carbon budget framework and the kind of numbers, the Excel spreadsheets and everything, when you reach the 2 degrees kind of level? Because then the two things in the Paris Agreement are kind of gone.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you set a different kind of target or level? Because talking about degrees then might not be as relevant.
No.
And maybe it's coming back to tipping points, but then we don't really know exactly where they are in this.
I think we have to remind ourselves that the temperature, we're not focused on temperature. Well, we are focused on temperature, but temperature is just a proxy for the real issue behind all of this. And that's about impacts. And even there, I do argue that it's not about impacts, it's about the rate of change of impacts. So if the rate of change of impacts is one that human systems can evolve to deal with, and so can ecosystems, because we are part of the ecosystems, we can't live without them. So if those two can evolve with the rates of change that we're seeing, then fine. But if they can't, then we're in real trouble. And the rates of change that we're seeing now in terms of warming and therefore the impacts, I mean, we're heading in a direction there's not a hope that our human systems will be able to deal with them. Our human systems already struggle to deal with the extreme weather events that we get anyway, let alone the extreme weather events that are exacerbated and then increased in frequency and severity as we get more climate change. Let alone on top of all that, all the other ecological challenges that we're facing by, what the damage we're doing to the oceans, how come we're destroying a lot of pollinating insects, and all those other things that we're completely reliant upon. So there's sort of the whole nested suite of huge challenges that we have there, and that temperature is just a proxy for those. So if we end up meeting, remember the carbon budget, we use up the carbon budget for 2 degrees centigrade before we hit 2 degrees centigrade. So there's this lag between the emissions you put out. So the 2 degree C carbon budget will be gone in, 10, 13, 14 years from now. Very little time from now, if we kept on at current levels of emissions, and of course emissions are still going up. And so I think we have to come back to remind ourselves, when we signed the UNFCCC back in 1992, and I think this is really key for those of us who are interested in climate change to remember this, we signed up to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In other words, we have to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. We didn't sign up for 1.5 or 2. That quantification came out later. And that's why we have to revisit it from time to time, because actually, is our understanding from the science, does it tell us that the impacts look much greater at these temperatures? And that's what it typically is doing. And so we have to revisit, what do we think is dangerous? And remember that science only informs that debate. Scientists have their own view of what's dangerous, but a scientist in Sweden may have a different view to a scientist in Bangladesh. So science just informs that discussion. What is dangerous is a cultural, a political, a social issue. And Paris came up with a 1.5 to 2 degrees C framing, and let's also be clear, those negotiations are dominated by the wealthy global north. The global south are held back in those at every single level, where it's the amount of people attending, the amount of lawyers that are there, the amount of time that they get, all of those things, they're held back. But nevertheless, their voice did come through to some degree in the 1.5 framing. If we fail on these, then we are going to need some other way to think about these sets of issues. But we'll also have to start to think, well, what are the impacts? It's not the same world. A world of 2 degrees centigrade of warming, it isn't the world we're in today. And I think we also still, almost a lot of us who work on climate change, sort of have a sort of a form of denial there. We keep forgetting when we think about the future. It's not the future like now. There is no a new now. There isn't a new now, because we're in a process of rapid change. So tomorrow will be different now to today, because we'll carry on emitting. And I think it's also key to remember that we do not stabilize the temperatures until we actually stop emitting. When you just reduce the emissions, the temperature still goes up. And so it's not about a matter of saying, oh, look, we've done well, we've brought the emissions down by 10%. That still means a rise in temperature. You have to literally eliminate, particularly carbon dioxide, and that basically means eliminating fossil fuel use. And it means eliminating it incredibly quickly as well. So if we do fail on 1.5 and 2 degrees, well, we have failed in my view on 1.5. If we do fail on 2 degrees centigrade, which I think we will do in just a handful of years from now, unless we do fundamentally change our approach, then we will have to rethink. And who's the we in this? I mean, who are the people that we brought into that discussion? Will it be people at the sharp end of climate impacts? Or will it be the global wealthy people from the global north who think they can insulate themselves from the climate impacts? So we need to be thinking through those issues now about what do we do to head in that direction. But also, I will just come back slightly on the idea that we're structurally locked into the infrastructure, which of course we are, but then it takes necessarily a long time to change. The two elements that I think are really important there. First, if you are serious about climate change, the language I've used, I suppose repeatedly for years now, is like a Marshall Plan on steroids, like the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War, after we'd destroyed it all. So we would have to make our key focus of the productive element of our society being in ensuring we move to a decarbonised future. And that's not just about the energy system, it's about the demand side as well, about our houses, the transport network and all those other things. But so there's that structural lock-in. But the other part of it, and I think this is really key, and we almost never discuss this, are what I refer to as discretionary emissions. Most of the emissions come from a relatively small group of us, a sizable minority, and those emissions aren't structurally locked in. They are discretionary. They could be stopped almost within the week. We have just unprepared to open that debate. The scientific community has been unprepared, the expert community, the social science community, the humanities, they would not been prepared, other than the odd exception, to open up that debate about actually most emissions are are embedded in discretionary activities that could be stopped if we thought climate change was serious enough and we would put the legislation in. My concern on this is who are the people who are in that group? It is the climate scientists, particularly the senior ones. It is the policymakers, the business leaders, all the people that have done particularly well out of the economic growth that our society produces collectively, and they've taken a disproportionate section of that. We are unprepared to have that debate about discretionary emissions opened up. And that's where the early emissions could come from. It will take time to retrofit all our houses, to completely switch our public transport systems, to move for massive levels of electrification. That will take some time, even with a Marshall Plan on steroids. But in the interim, we could be putting policies in which very rapidly curtailed our discretionary emissions. And another important part of that is that those two bits, discretionary emissions and structural lock-in, go hand in hand. Because where is the productive capacity of our society today? The labour and the resources are furnishing the relative luxuries of people like me. But those labour resources will be needed to decarbonise infrastructure, to retrofit our houses, to put in buses and trams, and all of those other things, as well as electrifying our energy system with zero carbon energy supply. So the combination of those two things, discretionary and moving labour and resources, are key if we're going to get anywhere near even the 2°C framing. And yet that debate is simply not being had in the climate realm. We're still just living in, you use the language already, sort of like a Harry Potter future. And keeping our fingers crossed that somehow we'll muddle through this. But when that language is used, and I've heard other academics use that language, we'll muddle through, the we is important in that. That we, again, will muddle through, and we're prepared to sacrifice a lot of people elsewhere as we do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just because something takes time to get in place, it's not a reason to delay it. I mean, just because if you need to build something that takes a long time, that's even a better reason to start earlier or start today on doing some of these things.
But just on that point, I regularly get asked about, these things take a long time to do and also they're more expensive. Well, actually, I think a lot of the time are they more expensive. In a lot of the Northern Hemisphere, and it also affects the Southern Hemisphere as well, but I don't talk too much about that part of the world because it's not a part I feel culturally informed about. But in the Northern Hemisphere, when Putin, I see it very much as Putin invaded Ukraine, that meant that we saw a rocketing in prices of fossil fuels. And that really impacted sort of average and lower income people in our societies. And so governments often had to sort of bail them out to some extent because they could no longer even afford to heat their homes, basic things. Was that because we had too much renewables? Or was it because governments had chosen there to remain locked into a fossil fuel infrastructure rather than make the conversion across? If we'd made the conversion across, if we'd started it in 1992, and not just had it in addition to fossil fuels, but actually as a substitute for fossil fuels, then we would have been anywhere near as beholden to the Russians on the globalized fossil fuel market. So I think actually, if a lot of our policymakers were serious about the security and the well-being of their citizens today, they would be making these sorts of changes. So it's not that these things are just expensive. Actually, they can be really positive for us in terms of, in this case, the energy costs of people, particularly the prices of people living in average income and low income. That's the majority of people in our society who really struggled then, and they're still often struggling with energy prices. But it also improves air quality. It's better for job security. So there are lots of things that are really positive about a policy landscape which is addressing the climate challenge seriously. But we seem to just look at it as if somehow it's just a cost. I would argue the status quo, what we're doing today, is where the real costs are, almost regardless of climate change.
Yeah, and maybe in a very concrete sense, I mean, a wealth tax or a tax on billionaires would be one way of funding this, but that might be popular with a majority, but it might not be so popular with the billionaires. So
yes, and also yes, definitely. I mean, I find there's something to me deeply concerning about a system that sees it perfectly reasonable to see some individuals have more GDP, almost like more income than the GDP of a country, and in some countries. And also, it doesn't just come with the money, it comes, of course, with the power. Because if you get weak policymakers, and often policymakers are quite shallow people, they easily, not all of them, but they easily get taken in. The billionaire rings them up and they'll be, they'll yes sir, no sir, what would you like? And so I think we have to, question the billionaires and how is reasonable that our society does that, supports that. But also, it's not just about the billionaires. It's about the professors. It comes a lot closer to home. And it's easy to point at the billionaires out there from positions of relative luxury that lots of others of us in our society have. So I think there's a sizable minority of us who are reluctant to see a change in the overall framing, if you say it's something like a wealth tax, whatever it may well be. I mean, in terms of the actual policies to drive the changes in each country, I do think they're quite culturally specific. So what would work in China would be different to what worked in Sweden. What would work in Sweden would probably be different to the US or the UK. And so I think the actual policies themselves are things that governments need to put in place. I mean, some may prefer taxes, and some may prefer regulations and standards. So I think there are a suite of policy options for driving emissions down. What I quite like about the carbon budget framing is a sort of subsidiarity concept. Once you've got a way to allocate the budget out to nations in a way that's in line with our UNFCCC and our Paris Agreement, once you've got that, then you can say to nations, well, it's up to you how you stay within that. That's your choice. I don't think we should be imposing particular policy frameworks on nations. It's up to them to determine that.
Yeah, and the European Union established like a pandemic recovery fund after the pandemic, and now a parallel discussion to climate and how you actually get funds for all of this. Around defense spending, it's both emergency loans, but it's also discussion of like a temporary tax.
Yes.
And probably taxing with inflation and everything else, it's not going to be taxing the people that doesn't have money. There's a discussion at least of a wealth tax in some countries.
Yes.
So that how that kind of debate plays out, which might be a different field from climate, but it is related. And then the risk is always that all the money that goes into that means there's no money going into like how we transform society.
Yeah, I think there are two things in that. One, the language we repeatedly hear, in at least in my experience in the UK and the Europe, but I gather it's the same in the States, the cost of living crisis, austerity, that we haven't got any. We are incredibly wealthy. I mean, if I just think about the UK, government's been banging on for years now about the cost of living crisis. We don't have a cost of living crisis. We have an equity crisis. We've got 68, 69 million people living in the UK. And in absolute terms, we're the 6th or 7th richest country in the world with only 0.84% of the world's population. So a really small percentage of the world's population. And we're incredibly wealthy, yet we still use the language of austerity and cost of living crisis. There is no cost of living crisis. Other than the one that is deliberately imposed because we want to hand out the huge wealth and the annual income of the UK to a small group of people, relatively small group of people. And that language, of course, is reinforced by the journalists. So we then live again in another imaginary world rather than the real world where we have huge resources in somewhere like the UK. But that's true of a lot of the global north countries. So we could easily be addressing these challenges but it's where do we ascribe the resources? And then going back to, you mentioned the pandemic. In the UK, and I think this happened elsewhere, every Thursday evening, people would come out of their houses and get a pan and bang it to thank the wonderful workers who literally were putting their lives on the line, whether that's the bus drivers or whether it was the nurses or some of the other medics or the ancillary staff in the hospitals. People doing it, or people working in the supermarkets, across the board. But a lot of these people were the people who were the least well paid in our society. So we weren't prepared to pay them, but we were prepared to bang pans for them. And at the end of that, we never ended up paying them anymore anyway. So we just let them die in larger numbers, and with this sort of pretense that we cared. But I think that also demonstrated again, where is the true value in our society? Were we really short of billionaires during the pandemic, or were we short of these people who were, or these people we really had to value, who were making the system still operate at significant risk to themselves? So I think there are lessons to learn from that, which we did not learn. We didn't relearn that actually real value is not where we're placing it at the moment. There are lots of people in our society who do wonderful work that we just take for granted. And if you think of it like that, then you start to think, well, there's huge resources in our society that we can mobilize in different ways. But our governments are reluctant to do that. And partly in part because they come from those backgrounds themselves, but also because they know that who owns the mainstream media is the very wealthy. So and the business leaders and all the others. So the narrative around any sort of change that is going to be socially progressive is going to be one that is opposing it. It's not that most people are against it, but the narrative that will be dominating the media is one that's against it. And that in that way, I think the system we have today is sort of locked into failure. And until we can break out of that. And some of the disruption that we've seen over recent years maybe suggest there are early signs of that. And I'm not saying that any of these are necessarily good, but if you go from Brexit to the yellow vests in France, to what's happened in the US, that you can look at these in different ways. I'm not trying to make any comment about whether it's good or bad. All I'm simply making the comment is there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the establishment has been for a long time. And perhaps it isn't perhaps these are all signals of a sign of unrest that could be precursors or symbols of a need for some sort of change. Now, that change, of course, could go in a really negative direction, which at the moment is probably more suggesting it's going to do that, the more progressive direction. But perhaps those degrees of unrest are there, and that is a point at which you can see change, if you like, a social tipping point. Maybe we've seen some early signs that it's there. But I say it doesn't seem to me at the moment that it's tipping in a more progressive direction. It seems almost going the other way. Going back to your point about we've moved from a sort of rules-based society, but I think had huge problems with it anyway. But we've moved from that to supposedly powerful men, otherwise known as bullies in this case, and the art of the deal and this sort of framing. Yeah, I could be wrong with this. I hope it doesn't last, but I also hope we don't go back to exactly the rules-based system that we had before, because that had locked in all sorts of problems and inequalities in our world. Anyway.
Yep. Okay, we're going to switch over to the two final points I have here on my list, and now it's a bit more podcasty, fun, light, since we covered all the heavy issues. It doesn't have to be light, but yes, so yeah. I came up with this category at the end of the podcast. So let's add a slide to Kevin's presentation. Your PowerPoint presentations are quite long as it is, but I thought it'd be fun, at least for some of these podcast episodes, that we can I found this. This might be fun to add to.
I should say I haven't seen this before.
No, you haven't seen it. We have not prepared in that sense. So this is a quote by David Graeber, late David Graeber, an author, anarchist. He's written a lot of, I don't think, maybe there's one or two here up here in the bookshelf as well. I think there has been a war of the imagination over the last several years. I was thinking a lot about what there might be to be optimistic about, and I came to the conclusion that this feeling of hopelessness that everybody has is a manufactured product. And that's what neoliberalism is really about. Neoliberalism isn't just an economic program. It's a political program designed to produce hopelessness and kill any future alternatives. And I thought this connected to your last slide and this quote by Gramsci that you used. Yes, yeah. And this also is very much where I am. You end up in this very dark place of hopelessness, but then you start feeling like, is it me telling this story, or is this story coming from somewhere else? Is it it's my feelings attaching to somebody else's story or way of framing the issues. So,
yeah, I do think our imagination has been deliberately constrained. And I spent, during my PhD, I went back into the oil industry for 1 year to earn enough money so I could sit in on a large part of an economics course. Because I was really unimpressed by what I'd learned about economics, but I thought perhaps I needed to know more about it. Several years later, I left the economics course thinking, well, I don't think it really has a lot to offer. At least that's sort of if you like, the market type economics. But now, well, over quite a few years, I'm beginning to think that was only ever used as an instrumental tool and I've started to use the language of neoliberalism. I was reluctant to use it at first, but I think it is appropriate. And that's a power struggle. That's a power issue. And they just use economics and this idea of free market economics. We've never had free market economics. We're nowhere near free market economics. Even a country like the US spends about half of its GDP approximately is determined where it's going to be spent by the state. And even after Musk has done what he's done, it'll still be a large proportion of their GDP is spent by the state. So we've never had free markets. What we have are constrained markets. And I think the neoliberal agenda was misused economics as if to sort of suggest that's the way we need to look at the world, because it fits nicely with some of the arguments it's trying to make, which is about power and maintaining power within relatively small groups and elites. And one of the great ways of doing that is to constrain imagination and to break us all down into being individuals. So collectively, we have far more power than the Trumps, than the Musks, than the Bezoses and the Gates of this world. So these people only have power because we have been broken down into individuals. But collectively, we have more power. And we have more economic wherewithal than any of these people. But the longer they can maintain us as individuals, the more limited is our imagination of conceiving of alternatives. And that's why I quite like the Robert Unger quote, that we lack the imagination and courage to conceive that the future can be, indeed will be different. And I think that's really important there, that we need to open up that landscape, that imagination. And once you do that, you start to think of different ways of looking at the world. But that's been deliberately constrained by the neoliberal agenda project, whatever you want to call it, program, which has been phenomenally successful. In my darker moments, I'm concerned here that framework, that cultural framework, is being so successful, it just sucks everything else in. So almost every culture that gets near it, I always think in my head I use the sort of the black hole metaphor. As you approach it, everything gets sucked in and destroyed. And that's how it seems to be at the moment. So I sometimes think, well, are we? And I should say here, one of my colleagues I work with really doesn't like me using this sort of way of framing it, but it's how I see it. And I hope his view is correct. But I would not be surprised if we end up being just a little, blip in the fossil record. That was us. And we've been here for a long time, but in terms of the largest population, it's only a very short period of time. And we were very, very few people on the planet for most of human history. It's only really been post-Enlightenment and mostly post-Industrial Revolution where the population has rocketed. And in that time, a particular culture has emerged which seems to be destroying all the other cultures that actually had survived, some of them, for centuries, if not millennia. So I am slightly concerned that the neoliberal agenda may be one that we simply can't escape, that everything is sucked in. But the nice thing about a black hole metaphor is there are, on the event horizon, on the outside of the black hole, there are things that escape, little quantum events. And it might be those that allow us to find a new way to escape the neoliberalism. In my view, neoliberalism will not be able to address the challenges that we're facing. It's had a relatively short life, and it's already found wanting in terms of living in the physical constraints, the ecological constraints, and I would argue in the social and human constraints of the planet on which we live. But at the moment, we don't seem to find alternatives, not at large scale. There are a few people standing up against it, but so on climate alone, there are no climate progressive countries in the global north. Every country claims it's a leader, like the UK and so forth, and then deliberately fabricate the numbers to make it look like they're doing really well. I mean, basically, whatever language you want to use around it, we're broadly lying to each other about that. And there are a few examples. Colombia has stood up and said we're not going to exploit more fossil fuels. A huge pressure has been put on them to try and do that. At the moment, they're holding that. So there are a few examples of leaders who have shown a strength and commitment. But by and large, they've not come from the so-called progressive countries. that neoliberalism, this quote seems to capture it really well, that neoliberalism is the real challenge to climate change. And ultimately, if I was given do I think neoliberalism will outlive, be more important than the physics? No, every time I come down on the physics will beat it. This is just an ephemeral phase. The problem is it one that will last so long that it will make it impossible for us to escape it? And then, of course, once we've gone, we'll escape it. The world will live perfectly well without us here. Or is it one that our humanity can escape out of this black hole that sucks us all in, into a way of looking at the world that is simply unsustainable? So I agree with the quote. I wouldn't call it light, this. I think this is even darker than some of the things we were talking about before.
Maybe it becomes even darker now. No, and I think also, thinking of it as an economic or a cultural powers kind of system, it's still a system made up by human beings making choices. And,
yes. Yeah.
And I think also being critical around the discussion around neoliberalism, and also around globalization in the early 2000s, a lot of people that had really fierce critique of neoliberalism was still painting neoliberalism as this all-powerful, always winning kind of system. Their critique was very valid, but you, in the students' minds or in your own mind, you got the sense that this system can't be beat. You can critique it, but you can't really beat it. Yeah. And the discussion of alternatives or like starting points of how do we change the system in like our small own local worlds was not part of it.
No. I think that's absolutely key. We need to find, this is the point, right? The success of it, almost beyond anything else, is about locking out imagination. If you open up imagination, that's the role of, CMUS is a wonderful place for doing that, but that's the role of a lot of educational institutes, this how it should be to me, is to start removing some of those boundaries that our cultural norms impose upon us. And then out of those, I don't know where they will go, but to some extent, that's the beauty of it. There's a sort of a flowering, if you like. And again, it will be culturally different in countries. Neoliberalism is an agenda that's dominated much of the global north, but it's not without some opposition, significant opposition. And I think it's true to say in some parts of the global south and some of the really powerful countries, the obvious ones that we might think about, some people may argue there's elements of neoliberalism there, but I think there are also elements that are very different. That doesn't mean to say that they don't come with their huge challenges and problems as well. But I wouldn't go as far as to say there is no way out of it. I think there probably are ways out of it. I think we could postulate ways out of it. We can imagine ways out of it, but they're not being delivered at the moment. But I think that's partly because there's lack of imagination and to break us down into individuals. If we start to come together as collectives, then I think we can be far more powerful than the powerful few that dominate the neoliberalism agenda.
Yeah, and I think also some of those initiatives and people coming together, that is happening in the US right now, but we're not seeing that much. In social media, some things kind of seep through, but there's initiatives and there's traditional actors like unions, but also more like loosely affiliated organizations coming together. But that is history being made now.
Exactly that, and that's my point I made earlier, that there's a lot of unrest that's manifest in different ways, and it's easy to deliberately misread that, I think. So I'm sure a lot of people, I won't hide, I have no time for Donald Trump, but I wouldn't, if I was living in the US, I don't think I could have voted for the Democrats either. I would have to vote somewhere else. But I think that dissatisfaction, in some respect, is a symbol of that we haven't been happy with how things are. That we are in this process of change. But where does it go from here? I don't think that's set in stone as to where it goes from here. I think it could go a number of directions. The problem for me, from a climate point of view, is it imposes a timeline that is so incredibly tight. And if we don't abide broadly by that, or operate or change things within that timeline, then the physics doesn't really care about our political machinations. It doesn't really care about our cultures and our humanity. The physics will literally play out and make it incredibly difficult for us to maintain or hold on to any meaningful humanity with significant numbers of people still on the planet. So that timeline dimension of the physics, I think is a real challenge. So we are seeing some shifts, some changes. Will they play out in a sufficiently short time? The jury's out on that at the moment, but it won't do unless we are more honest and open up our imaginations.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap this up, and I'm gonna put you on the spot. I should maybe I'm putting myself on the spot as well. But are there any books or other material or people's work, something that is on your mind now or on your desk or in your bag that you want to bring up?
Well, what I want to bring up is an interesting one. I mean, my reading, and this is how I deal with some of the challenges. So we all deal with these things differently. And my reading at the moment, I've got Bikepacking in Scotland, one of the books I'm reading. And so, I think this is probably worth mentioning. This is that for a lot of people, when you start to understand the challenges we face, the climate ones, the broad ecological ones, and indeed I think lots of the more sort of social ones and sometimes what we do as a species and our humanity, you can be left in a very dark place. And I think that is, I understand but can't empathise with those that really struggle with that. I think there is a real risk, and I think we have to be, well, it's not just a risk, it's a reality for some people, that this is psychologically incredibly challenging for them. I can only talk, so I can appreciate others have that, and that's why I say I can understand it but can't empathise with it, because I don't have that. And it's not that I have some great, wonderful belief and some unsubstantiated hope that we're going to easily get out of this. I don't. But I am able to park that to some extent and move away from it. But it also feeds back into things. When I'm looking and thinking about, I'm a keen cyclist, and there's a beauty in the landscape, the flowing through the landscape at the pace of cycling or indeed walking, which is very different to being in a car or a train or something like that, or even more in an aircraft. And so perhaps my outside reading, the books and things that are important to me are ones that take me somewhere else, but actually inform, I suppose, indirectly inform my thinking about the world, about the issues that I address at work. And so my recommendation to other people from books I would read is say choose something else sometimes that's quite different. I quite like sort of philosophical type books as well to read. So there's a wonderful little book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which I'm about to start reading again. And it takes you, I'm a slow reader, so it'll take me a few hours, but for a fast reader, it's just probably a couple of hours. It's a wonderful book. And I think books that open up that process of thinking, and that may be novels. I don't read many novels anymore. I used to read a lot more novels, but not so much now. Those sorts of books, I would say, that where people should be looking, not necessarily going to look at books that relate to the sort of challenges we face. I would add one other book that I think was really good, and I'm not a great fan usually of these sort of populist type or popular books and maybe populist books, but the one by Monbiot and terrible, it's a Peter, I forgot this other person that he wrote it with. It's a short book, and a short book is always harder to write than a long book, but a short book on neoliberalism, and I think it does a really good job of deconstructing it. It's not a big read, it's not a long read. I think perhaps it's because it does tap into things that when you're reading it, you go, oh, of course. It brings those of courses together into make a very clear sort of picture. So that's a book I would say is really important and has a climate element to it, if you like.
And I have not read it, but I know it's circulating here at SEMS as well. So that's probably a good recommendation. So I think that's everything for today. We've done a lot of, I think this is an hour. I forgot my phone somewhere, but roughly an hour.
Yes.
That's usually what we aim for. And this is the first in this experiment, this journey together. So we'll see when we are back with the next episode and what kind of form that will take. I mean, there's so many people we should interview and talk to, and also try to bring up this other perspectives or new takes on things. So. And
probably the important one is to escape the usual suspects. I don't mean to be particularly critical of them, but we know who they are, and it's to bring in other voices that will actually, that do come to these issues from a different perspective with a different lens.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin, so much.
And thanks
Daniel. Everybody listening. And on towards the next episode and other adventures.
Thank you.